All right. So we heard from these four ways in which they're working with challenges in the market, also ways in which they're incorporating Spectra product. Now, I know some of them spoke more about the solutions they were using and some of them less. So before we start the Q&A, and we'll start with you, Stephen, on the end, could you just say briefly the Spectra solutions that you currently have installed? And you don't have to elaborate, but just to give the audience a feel for what you haven't installed today.
Well, we have a T950 with about 200 active slots. We use the QStar software as an active archive, and we have a 2U Verdi with 6 disks, I think. Mm-hmm. We use the internal disks on our server as part of the cache for QStar, plus we also use the Verdi as well as part of the cache and part of the backup process for trying to we're trying to keep a copy of all the files on the last tape as it's get written to tape in case there's an accident with the library.
Great. All right, Mr. Duke.
We have a couple T950 libraries and a couple of the smaller libraries as well, and we have a Verde, and we're just kicking off a test with Black Pearl.
Oh, okay,
so we're
fantastic.
very excited about that, but have several libraries in several locations.
Great. And Steve.
I don't do hardware.
Okay.
I'm software as a service, but all of our customers, right? That's the interest for us is
Right.
As a solution to all our university customers.
So you're
who
more
need-
on the integration side
That's
and
right.
things of that nature,
That's
right,
right.
for some of the customers we work with. All right. And finally, Bo.
Well, we have obviously the British Film Institute is the biggest one we have. That's the Black Pearl with the back-end libraries. We also have SpectraLogic libraries in our facility because we do in our stewardship program we use multiple types of media. And so we use an IBM library to do the 3592 backups, and then we use the SpectraLogic to do the LTOs. In the future, we're considering switching over to the SpectraLogic libraries to do the IBM tapes as well. But the reason we use multiple media types is because we want to ensure that we protect against a bad batch. So if there's a media type that has a flaw in it, we won't lose customer data because we'll always have a secondary technology. So we always keep our
Gotcha.
steward data on 2 different types.
And now, do you guys have an Arctic Blue on site yet? You do.
I wasn't
Okay.
sure if I could talk about it, so I didn't talk about
You
it
can
earlier.
now.
Okay, so
These guys can't talk about it for another day or so.
all
but-
right, so yeah, pretend you didn't hear this. But anyway, we have one of the systems in house. It's a test system. It works really well. We went through the configuration process. It was a dream to set up. The advanced bucket management, although you really got to come up with a better name. The advanced bucket management is very easy to use. Fire Brigade. There you go.
There you go.
Well, it's halfway between a Black Pearl and Arctic Blue. I'm not sure, somewhere in there. But Blue Ice. But in any case, it's very easy to use setup. And the nice thing about the policies is it not Blue Ice. Oh, that'd be even more interesting.
drug or a breath
Well,
mint?
Black Pearl probably is too. So. Oh, yeah. Forgot about that. Anyway, the policies are very easy to configure to tell it whether you want to have copies just on disk, copies on tape, copies on one type of tape. It's all very easily configurable. So it's a very simple system to manage. And the only thing you would want to do is have a technician install it because that's a lot of disks to install in that chassis. And you want to make sure that an operator that's putting it in isn't dropping those in just like they're, slots. And you want to be careful putting all that in there. So, but
All right, great. So with that overview, we're going to open it to Q&A. Molly Ernst is going to work this side of the room. If you have a question, just throw up your hand. We'd like you to use the microphones, and I'll work this side. So any questions for our panel? And we'll take maybe about 10 minutes just so you can have some Q&A, and then we'll bring up Mr. Brian Granger again. Any questions? We could do it less than 10 minutes if we needed to. Okay.
So what functionality are you still hoping that Spectra will bring to the line? What are you still wishing for, even after Arctic Blue?
I know one that he's already mentioned, geo clustering, but the replication and the ability to have multiple nodes all over the world and have them all in sync with each other is obviously very important because there are going to be many customers and in some cases partners who want to have that in their data centers to ensure that the data is not just protected between a couple of sites, but anytime they want to add a new site, customer or their own.
Yeah, I was going to point at sort of the offsite DR sort of capabilities, whether it's into the cloud or right other remote.
So for us, I've been talking to all the storage vendors for many years about adding tape as a tier. beneath the tiers that they have available. So, we have a lot of, Isilon systems and, other big disk systems, big NAS systems. And the truth is the tape piece behind it is cumbersome and making that simple. And so if they're not going to do it and Spectra would, then, we'll see a shift in what we use as our production NAS systems.
Great question. Was there a question, Molly, from the other side of the room?
Hi, I've been asking the same question for about 15 years now, and I'm waiting for a satisfactory answer, so hopefully. Basically, I come from the information management space, so in that world, everything is not simplistic Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, and so forth. You have those assets, which are, generally created, think of them as your primary assets. And then you have compositions of those assets that are part of asset management systems. They're part of, let's say, if you're using an application like Adobe After Effects, where it's going to pull in resources to create a multimedia output from resources that are all linked. So it knows the relationship, much like a family tree, and the individual elements, the people that form that tree and all their relationships. So storage tends to take a very simplistic view of that, where you're managing a bunch of Word documents, or you're managing things based on the frequency that they're accessed. But it needs to have a much more sophisticated view of that landscape. So how are you implementing a technology like Black Pearl or Arctic Blue to manage not only those assets, but all the relationships that are created by the other applications, such that everything remains intact? You don't want to pull back an asset without also pulling back all the relationships that make that asset have value.
So I'll answer that in two different ways. One of the things that was shown up here was Avid's workflow, and we use a lot of Avid, and Avid actually does that very, very, very well in their Interplay system. So Interplay allows you to keep multiple resolutions of the same content, and to be able to say, I'm going to send 3 versions to the archive in these different resolutions, or no, only send my highest to the archive. Let me edit on a low resolution, and then let me go back and relink to the high res and bring it back from the archive. So you can do that in a very simplistic way. The other thing that we've done, and that speaks to your the comment about all of these relationships, we believe that data has relationships very much like family, and that we have to keep genealogy of data. Where did this file come from? Who created it? Does it have a child, right? What's that child? Where is that child? If we find the child, we need to go back to its parent and find out where that parent came from, et cetera. And one of the things that we've implemented is, especially in our visual effects world, our visual effects artists, and this is common amongst the industry, are constantly doing that. They're constantly linking. They've got symbolic links and everything going off to a myriad of files. Our sound effects editors do the same thing, right? They have a huge sound effects library, and so they go there to get rain, and they go there to get wind, and they go there to, and they're just linking to it, right? And so it doesn't exist in every single project. So one of the things that we've done in our archiving step is we've said you've got the archiving process has to understand the symbolic links and where everything that is linked. And if we're putting that away, we have to go get all of those assets too, and we do, and we put them away where necessary. Where we don't, where it's not necessary, and we can come back and link to them and bring back the linked file, then we do that. So we very much have to keep that hierarchy and that understanding of genealogy of families, or genealogy of the family of media assets.
Are you storing that all in the same repositories, or now do you have your Black Pearl handling
So
some of it, and then other repositories handling?
for the most part, it's the same. Right now, it's the same repository. Yep.
I was just going to say, the paradigm you're talking about to me kind of goes to another area, and that's it sounds a lot like a source tree model, where you've got all your dependencies, et cetera. And those dependencies could be in any number of places, but ultimately it's dependent on a database that tracks all those dependencies. So in our case, we have a system we use for managing seismic data, and with seismic, a customer may want a particular location, and then we have to provide all of the assets associated with that particular line or that location. And we have that in a database. Now, the big challenge we have today is that we have to use file paths as the locator for those files. And if that file path changes, or if technology changes, or we decide we want to move it to a different location, you know, en masse, whatever, we have to go back and re-index everything and relocate it. So that's one of the reasons that Black Pearl is so intriguing, is because it uses an object ID. So now the file's location isn't my problem. The application knows the ID. I query the Black Pearl for that object, and now it'll go retrieve it from its system and send it to me, because the Black Pearl is effectively a giant database.
Same thing is true with the Interplay world. It's actually assigning a hidden media ID, so it can come back to any workspace, anytime, anywhere, totally different file path.
Well, the only reason I had asked the question is because usually it's the maintaining, a human being is usually the one involved with maintaining the relationship between those two. So you've got the genealogy somewhere, you've got the assets somewhere else, and usually that connection is not automated in any way, and it's usually not a storage application that's doing it. Someone has to know, oh, that build of that, let's call it a corporate asset, that build had very specific versions, very specific assets, and only that person knows about it. And so now, you know, they have to do the rebuilding and pulling in and bringing them back to a location that would make the application that manages it usable. Because you can't just, you know, I can't open up After Effects and say, okay, give me the composition. I have to make sure that all the paths point to legitimate assets, and I have to know where those assets belong. Well, that has to be automated, and the genealogy that's in After Effects has to be saved along with it. It's a package deal.
So one of the things that we've had to do is looking at transformations going forward. Sometimes it's exactly that. You have to keep computers, OSs, and applications from when those things were created, right? So that you have any hope of going back to get that to reopen and to move something forward. Just like we had to keep, you know, 2-inch tape decks around because we had 2-inch tape in the library, right? Have to keep the deck. Can't get rid of the deck if you still got the tapes.
Mr. Teaton, did you have something to add to that?
No, it's okay.
All right, another question here.
Yeah, I think actually I like the beginning of your question, which went to the premise of the complexity of archive generally, which is usually you got to get masses of asses in a room and have them agree on policies, come up with metadata categories, assign files those metadata values so that you know what the objects are that you're storing, and so you can search them efficiently and retrieve them. And usually when you're doing a workflow integration, like what you've been describing here, whether it's video assets or it's seismic data or whatever, those are known workflows, and they already have an identification path associated with them, and their metadata is pretty consistent. But try doing that in accounts payable in a typical company, or in a project-oriented construction firm, or whatever. My question actually is for Dr. Pickering. I wanted to ask you, you said something, and then I don't know if it was bad hearing, but I never heard the completion of the thought. It was a criteria of your early evaluation of which solution to prefer, that it had to be a solution that was not proprietary, that it couldn't come from a single vendor, that required standards-based aspects and also multiple sources of supply. So if vendor A went by the boards, you could always continue to build out that product with vendor B. Yet you have embraced the model espoused by Spectra, which seems to be pretty, at least in the core technology, pretty much proprietary just to SpectraLogic. How did you rationalize that? You know, how'd you mend that split between your original thinking of going completely vendor agnostic and the later reality of having to turn to a semi-proprietary solution in order to get the job done?
When we first looked at it, we looked at all the major tape manufacturers like IBM and Oracle. All the companies. And because we didn't have a very clear idea of what software we wanted and how we wanted to use the system, was it going to be Active Archive, was it going to be Pure Archive? And because we had so little money, for £140,000, you can't afford most of the software. So I found P5 by Archiware, which was only £10,000, which is a very basic archiving piece of software Then we managed to get prices for Q-Star, which is like getting blood out of stone half the time. That was about £30,000. So that's, out of 140,000, that's not bad to spend 30,000 on software. But we knew in the future if we got more money and our need and uses might change, we didn't want to be tied to one particular piece of software. So if you buy IBM, you have to use IBM Tivoli Manager. No choice. We wanted a tape library which would work with lots of different pieces of software. And on the Spectra side, it lists all the companies, and you can ask anyone which products will work with the Spectra tape library. And I did all this research, and that's the reason why we chose it, because I knew in 2 years' time, if we want to change and say, okay, Q-Star's not working out for us, we're going to move to something else, we have a bit more money, we don't have to throw the hardware away. We know the hardware's there. Even though we are using Q-Star's proprietary tape format, TDO, we can write stuff to LTFS. So there's always that backup that if we do want to totally change to some other amazing piece of software, we can migrate stuff to LTFS and then into a new format. That was my justification for it. I mean, I'm no expert in enterprise architecture or anything like that, but I wanted a system where I knew if I changed my mind in 2 years' time, the hardware's still got to work. There might be a little bit of effort, but we can change software to suit our needs.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, and let me make sure I'm right. As long as the hardware components of the solution had enough standards basis that I could swap in and out other vendors inferior to SpectraLogic, if need be. That core technology, though, for defining the objects and for indexing those objects is still Black Pearl. It only comes from one source.
Yeah.
Did you do source code escrow? Something like that to insulate yourself against the possibility that it would never happen. Spectra would decide this isn't for them and they go on to a different technology and leave you with Spectra solution?
Well, we looked at Black Pearl, but because we're dealing with academics, I had to get a solution which was simple. They're used to using normal file systems. They know how to change directories, so we had to get a piece of software which would do that. You try and explain object storage to them, and there's no point. I wouldn't even waste my breath. It's got to be a solution which was simple, where they know how to interact with the system. Even ArchiWare P5, you had to have a new graphical interface, which means more training, explaining the system to them. For now, there's a new directory there. It's called Archive. Put your files in it. That's all I have to say.
Great. Okay.
And they could just interact with
So
the
you
system.
prioritized other values above the proprietariness
Yeah,
of just
object
that
storage
software.
will just confuse them a lot. And I think it's up to the user to decide how they store stuff. You will have a directory called docs, one called data, one called experiments, and people manage where they put the data themselves, and they know where it is, and it's up to them to know where it is.
And if I heard correctly, also the LTFS out was something that was appealing
Yes.
from that perspective. Okay, great. Any other questions? We've probably got time for one or two more. We've got a couple over there.
In your initial deployment, you had a lot of data to ingest in your systems, and that represents a lot of problems. How did you mitigate, the fact that when you started the deployment, there's so much data to put in, and then what types of bandwidth were you able to sustain?
And
Anybody?
anyone who's starting with a tremendous amount of information that you have to bring into a new system, any thoughts on that from any of you?
I mentioned earlier in my presentation, we're considering switching over to, I see it as very likely. Object storage has a lot of advantages for us because of the object ID and the fact that we don't have to track all these file paths. So we would have to export 10 petabytes of data from our legacy system over to the Black Pearl environment. So it would be a monumental project. But we would run that through automation in the background. The users wouldn't even know what was going on. We would migrate the data over, and then when the data was migrated, then we would take the existing front end that we have that talks to the file paths, and we would index that against the files in the new system. So it would be a background process that was going on, and when it was completed, then we would do a flip the switch, and everybody would start using the new system. So it's something I don't think with that amount of data you can do it on a weekend. I mean, it's going to be a months-long process to transfer that data over.
The Network Industry Association is doing work on long-term preservation. Are you following or participating in such efforts as that or other efforts similar to it?
Preservation of which assets?
Digital assets.
Any digital asset? Okay, because there are some requirements already for certain ones, and the companies obviously are reticent to to delete data even if they don't know if they want it. Really, we're not directly involved in that. So our main concern with legacy data, and when they bring it to us often, is to find out if there's any data in those inventories that isn't technically theirs, because acquisitions come in and data comes with that. You know, they get all the new acquisitions data and mix it with theirs, and then they'll find out in the future, sometimes even if it's been a setup, that the data that they now own doesn't belong to them, and they have to pay immense fines for possessing that data they shouldn't have. So for us, the long-term preservation is, I mean, they want to keep that data forever, but they also want to make sure they don't have any data that they're not supposed to own, and that's really where they use our services, is to go and index everything, find out everything they have, give them an inventory of what they actually own, because often they have no idea what they've got. And so that allows that to carry forward in perpetuity after that.
So the LDS Church definitely has that has an interest in that, and keeping up on the the absolute latest directions of really having preservation for long periods of time. In our world, we have actually two different departments that are responsible for that. The church history department has a preservation system, and that's what they call it. They call it a preservation system. And one of the differences between what we do and what they do, they look at things that are only historically significant content. And so in our world, I may keep copies of all of the different camera ISOs, right? And they don't want all those. They just want the master. And so we give them the master. And they want it in only a certain format and only a certain codec that they have, vetted and verified, and then they take it through a QC step. And so, they look at that as saying, Richard, your job is to keep media flowing for the next 30 years. Our job is 100 years plus. And so they're very, very, very tight on what they take in and what type of records and everything like that. And the same thing is true on the PDF documents that they take and everything like that. They won't just take any document. They won't just take any file. They're very, very specific about what they have. And again, they're looking to the future of saying we have to keep only a certain number of files that we know that we can migrate forward in the future.
In our universe, in the science universe, certainly what we're seeing is the research librarians are following a set of specification standards, mostly around DataCite, if you're familiar with that. It defines things around digital object identifiers, URI schemes for identifying assets long-term, and then DataCite schemas that are particularly well suited to the research world around optional, mandatory, and recommended schemas for capturing the provenance of data sets. So we're tending to follow those sorts of paths with our product.
Well, I think what we found, we have a repository for storing our publications. Trying to get people to fill in the keywords is a task, because the whole system they have is keyword search based. The system we have to deal with many different research groups who all act differently. So a simple file system suits all of them. We have no metadata. It's up to you to know where your data is. If someone leaves, the PI and the principal investigator is responsible for that data because they're head of the research group. It was easy for us to do it that way, so we could cope with lots of different groups, faculties, departments, different types of data, different file formats. We don't have to worry about any of the other stuff that goes on. We just store the physical file.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause for our panel and presenters today.